Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and you're all very welcome to this edition of Around the Editor's Table. As ever, ladies and gentlemen, we want your participation and engagement throughout, so please text us or WhatsApp us on 086 836 6465 any questions or comments that you may have. We come to you this afternoon as the government looks set to reveal their plan on how Ireland is going to reduce its carbon emissions by 51% over the next decade, in line with the Climate Action Bill. As we revealed on farmersjournal.ie on Saturday evening, emission reduction targets for housing, transport, energy and agriculture have generally been agreed around the Cabinet table. In the case of agriculture, the target range for emissions reductions over the next decade has been set between 21 and 30%. And while this target is less than what has been levied on other sectors, it is going to present a significant challenge and indeed a cost to Irish farmers. It's against this backdrop, ladies and gentlemen, that I'm delighted to introduce to you Jason Clay, Senior Vice President of the World Wildlife Fund. Jason is a thought leader and a renowned world expert on how farmers can be supported in addressing the environmental challenges of food production. He is a graduate at Harvard and Cornell, has been involved in the running of the family farm, so has a deep knowledge both at a technical and a practical farm level. Jason, you're very welcome here today, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Jason, maybe, and we'll discuss maybe European policy and we'll discuss Irish policy at a later stage, but maybe if I could just throw in the ball, so to speak, in relation to getting your views on what do you see happening globally in relation to where agriculture and indeed farmers sit in addressing these climate changes that we're all aware of, while also making sure that we continue to feed the world.
Well, I think that the issue of climate change and reduced emissions has finally come home, and now people are scrambling to try to figure out what to do. You mentioned some percentages that were being targets for the Irish farming sector, but those are actually absolute cuts. Those are not relative per liter of milk or whatever. Those are absolute cuts in the dairy sector, or others. So I think that's the first realization of people. That's the aha moment, if you will. But also, I think the problem is that most of the calculations about greenhouse gas emissions have been based on averages, and the methodologies aren't always the same. So we don't really know where we stand. A lot of the life cycle assessment those are done differently. And so what we're seeing is that averages are great maybe for the development of an assessment of what the total impact is, but they don't tell you where the hot spots are. And they don't tell you who you need to work with to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, much less what are going to be the incentives or what are going to be the ways that those people can actually move forward and contribute to the overall reduction of greenhouse gas emissions.
But Jason, in terms of the balance here, and we can look at this through one prism of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but you and I tonight will still sit down and eat a meal. We still need food, and it's balancing those emissions and recognizing that food production has an environmental footprint. What is the debate taking place at global level between getting the balance between those two in the context, and we spoke about this before, Jason, that there are some fairly stark projections out there as to the amount of food that we will need to produce in the coming decades?
Right. So you might, 10 years ago have thought it odd to invite somebody from an environmental group to talk about global food production and why they would be interested. But I think it's been clear to us for 2 or 3 decades that the biggest impact on the environment, both biodiversity and habitat and ecosystem services that we need, has been from where and how we produce food. It's the biggest single human activity in terms of biodiversity loss, habitat loss, water take, water effluent, soil health, chemical use, agrochemical use, and now greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not actually improving in fact, all the indicators are kind of going in the wrong direction at this point in time. And as you alluded to, the problem is by 2050, we're going to have more people, they're going to have more income, and they're going to consume more and differently. There's been a lot of debate about exactly how much more food we're going to have to produce. But a report that came out from the Tropical Forest Alliance and World Economic Forum before the UN Food System Summit this last summer suggested that in the first 19 years of this century, food consumption had increased 48% globally. If that's true between 2000 and 2050, any trend like that is going to be well over 100% increase in food production. And then the big question is that net consumption or is that gross production? Because in fact, for every 2 calories we eat, we waste 1. And so food waste is a huge part of this issue too, going forward. I think the pandemic though has maybe shown us that, or is maybe a precursor for how we should look at climate change. What we saw with the pandemic is that we have a kind of rolling impact of the pandemic on food production, from weather variability to labor shortages to bottlenecks in supply chains, et cetera. But going forward, we're going to need to figure out how to manage food production and consumption more at a planetary level than at a national level or even local level, because it's going to vary a lot. And so trade is going to become a huge part of our food system. And it's gone from about 6% of food being traded globally in the late 1990s to estimates now between 20 and 25%. So these are things that are going to make all of the issues of where and how we produce food even more important.
But Jason, have you touched on what is quite a major flaw in terms of how we are approaching this problem? You talk about it being a planetary problem and food production's environmental footprint being a planetary problem, but everybody is going off to try and solve it based on territory and achieving a territorial target. And how do you think that's actually the model that we should be doing? Should we not have a planetary approach to this in terms of trying to produce food on the right type of land at the right point in terms of the most sustainably efficient ways possible, or the most environmentally efficient ways possible?
Right. So I think that one of the things that we have come to realize is that it's important, nobody can solve this problem by themselves. Not a single producer, not a single company, not a sector, not the private sector, not a country. Everybody's got to be working together more in a coordinated way, not just to make sure that we have just-in-time delivery of food to all the people that need it around the world, but also to learn from each other. Because with climate change, we're going to have impacts on parts of the food system every single year that are going to be intense. We're going to have reduced production in some areas. We're going to need to fill that gap with trade from another area. In order to make this work and work smoothly, people have to be at the very least, learning from each other. Actually, I think much more coordination about setting up food reserves and using surplus in some areas in some years to start establishing reserves for others will be very important. I mean, one of the projections that is just mind-boggling, if you think about it, is that by 2050, there expect to be more than 1 billion climate refugees that are displaced from their homes. Now, many probably think about this as, coastal sea level rise, but it's also going to be in farming areas. We're already seeing hundreds of thousands of people from Central America moving into the US because they can't grow corn anymore. They can't make a living growing coffee. And so those are issues that are going to become much more prevalent around the world.
But Jason, on that specific of territorial targets, now it leads us on to the whole issue of carbon leakage. And I suppose I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit when I'm coming into Ireland. And one thing in terms of our sectoral emission targets here in Ireland, farmers are being given a narrative that we have to reduce cattle numbers, or there's pressure on cattle numbers, or restrict cattle numbers. And then we look to countries like Brazil, where they're ramping up 24 million more cattle on deforested Amazon rainforest. And it's not to blame either or, but it's more to discuss the feeling of everybody trying to achieve something in their own little backyard without having any consciousness of, as what you said, the planetary impact of their actions.
Right. So we may think global, but we still act local. I think that's kind of the point here. The other one, which I was remiss in not mentioning earlier, is that every country, or virtually every country, has a large rural population, and employment depends on producing food. And they may not be very efficient at it from a global point of view. I mean, because as we know, averages are averages. Half the people in the world are below that. And so they are going to be reluctant to get out of farming. And a lot of farming communities vote, and they vote to protect their way of life. That's probably only natural, but it's not actually what we need right now. What we need right now are much more forward-looking solutions where farming becomes part of that, or where farming communities have a foot in farming and a foot in food processing and some other kinds of issues. We've got to figure out how to produce it more efficiently, but also reduce waste and reduce post-harvest loss, and pivot consumption. I mean, all of those things are going to be important in a strategy as we go forward. Every country is probably going to decide a little bit different strategy, but I think if we look at, as a guiding principle, we need to look at what are the metrics we can live with. And so you just mentioned that the government is talking about reducing the number of cows. I mean, cows are at some level probably a problem, but the real issue is greenhouse gas emissions and pollution. And what we found in our work is when you give farmers or give producers a target and let them find the best way to achieve it, you actually get innovation, because some joker is going to go way beyond what you ever thought was possible, and then 2 or 3 more are, and then suddenly everybody is, and that's the new norm. Whereas if you give them a practice or a level that actually assumes a certain performance, like the number of cows or the number of hectares you can farm or whatever, you're going to get compliance with that law, but not necessarily the result you want. And you're certainly, I mean, compliance is not what we need in a global economy where climate change is going to be affecting production year in, year out. Going forward, it's all about change and being able to adapt to change quickly. And that's why I think using the right metrics is going to be really important.
I think, Jason, you've touched on something which is incredibly timely here in relation to the Irish debate, that it's very simple to talk about cow numbers and whatnot. Cows are not the problem. It's the emissions that we're trying to reduce. If part of that goal that we end up having to reduce cow numbers to get there, well, that's one of the outcomes. But it's actually the emissions, and it's staying focused on that emissions. Jason, just moving on slightly, but staying, and just picking up on something you said about this almost splurge mentality on food, in terms of 50% of the calories that we produce are wasted or don't make it onto the plate. Or maybe make it onto the plate and are scraped off it again. Is food too cheap? We live in a world today where the average household spend, certainly here in Ireland, in a developed country, it's less than 10%. I think it's 12% for the Europe, and maybe slightly higher for the US, but still very, very low. Does there need to have to be a discussion here around the price and the value that people put on food?
Yeah, I think this is ultimately the problem that a lot of people are starting to look at. You know, but let's put it in context. There are probably 1 billion people on the planet that spend most of their income on food and still go to bed hungry. So food is not too cheap for those people. Yeah. There are a lot of others where food is very cheap and it's wasted. But I think at a systemic level, the cost of food doesn't reflect the cost of production. Yeah. So these are what we call externalities, things that are subsidies from government, but most often subsidies from nature, at least on the environmental side. The subsidies from government are a little bit on the production, but probably more on the social side and in terms of poverty programs and other things that government does. I don't think we can actually bring the true cost of food production into the marketplace today simply by adding it onto the price, because then it's going to be very expensive and it's going to have a huge number of impacts. But we've got to be much smarter about how we can reduce those impacts, the environmental and social externalities of food production, in a way that doesn't simply ratchet up the price of food. So, for example, carbon markets or environmental service markets, biodiversity markets, habitat markets, markets for improvement of soil, etc. These are ways to do it. Long-term contracts are actually a way to do this. We're finding that the companies that want more resilient supply chains, if they're willing to put 3, 5, 10-year contracts on the table, not with a price, because nobody has a crystal ball that's that good yet. Certainly I don't. But if they will put the contract on the table with a price finding mechanism so that neither side actually loses, then we have an opportunity to actually, where the producer can take that contract and borrow money against it. It's an asset and can invest in more sustainable production. And we can amortize the cost of bringing externalities into prices that way. The same as with carbon markets and things like that. So I think if we can find ways to reorganize business so that some of the values stay, there's a stickiness in the value chain where they stay where they need to be to cover costs, then we're going to be actually better off. But right now, that's what a lot of smart people are thinking about. The environmental side, I think, is actually much easier to address than the social side, because changing business models, changing the way labor works, changing the price to labor. What's amazed me and come out in the pandemic is, and I think I probably knew this, it just never quite registered, that wages have basically fallen all over the world in the last 40 years. I recently did a calculation. I grew up on a small farm. I worked for other farmers during peak periods of labor needs. I was paid 50 cents an hour at that point. This was in the mid 60s. And that was seen as a child wage because I was living at home. I didn't have to rent an apartment. I didn't have to, to pay for my own food, clothes, all that stuff. But anything I made, I could spend on things I wanted to. Some kids bought cars, whatever. If you take that 50 cents an hour and bring it up to the present, in the US, that's a little bit over $8 an hour. That is above what the minimum wage is now. That's above what a worker is expected to pay for rent, pay for, school, pay for healthcare, pay for all those things. That's why so many poor people in the US have to have 2 jobs. But it's similar in other parts of the world as well. We need to figure out how to make these incomes livable in rural areas. And it's not just farmers, it's also farm workers.
Jason, just before we leave the whole global side, and I'm conscious COP26 is coming up and world leaders are descending on Glasgow in terms of to have debate. If you were to give them a piece of advice, if they were to come to you, and I'm sure many of them do, for input and guidance, how would you advise them to work together to prevent us just from shuffling emissions around the world and actually address that problem of absolute emissions from agriculture and food production? What piece of advice would you give them?
Well, I guess 2. One, I'm from a part of a state in the US that's called the Show Me State. And that basically, it's Missouri, and it means don't tell me what you're going to do, show me. So the first thing I would say about the COP is that talk's cheap. You have got to set up a system of reporting that's on an annualized basis where people can see the results and what is happening from those commitments that have been made at the big COP events. That's critical. But second, we're not going to get out of this individually. We have to work together. So start sharing data about what works. Start using government programs to leverage change rather than to solidify the system that we're trying to get rid of. many agricultural programs around the world maintain what we've got today. We don't need 20th century agriculture, no matter how good it is. We need 21st century, and we've got to be aiming towards 22nd century right now. We have to start those programs and learn faster from each other. So those two concepts, I think, are going to be the most important: report and learn.
Where does the accounting, and you talked about accounting in your opening address, Jason, in relation to accounting for emissions at production versus consumption? What's your view on that?
Well, if you're going to account for emissions at consumption, you need a carbon tax. You need some way for consumers to actually pay the embedded cost of carbon in the products that they consume, whether it's food or other things. But I think the way we're headed now is for companies to look at their supply chains to assess what their scope 1 emissions are, the things that they control, their factories, scope 2, the energy that they use to make those goods, and scope 3, which is in primary production and handling and initial processing, et cetera. In the food industry, scope 3 is by far the largest source of impacts. But the problem is companies don't control that. They can't actually change it. And what it requires is investments on the upstream side of producers, starting right on the land. This is where I mentioned long-term contracts. Having a line of sight on who you buy from allows you more traceability, more transparency. But it also allows you to, in those contracts, if you're buying dairy, could you also buy renewable energy that might be created from a biogas digester on a dairy or from a group of dairies? If you're buying the renewable energy or the renewable energy credits, could you then think about buying the liquid ammonia and NPK that come off the substrates of those biogas digesters? I mean, we're talking to fertilizer companies now about putting long-term contracts on the table for dairy farmers as an asset that they can use to actually go borrow the money to invest in biogas digesters. It's almost like a power purchase agreement before you build a thermal power plant. You need to have customers that want to buy this stuff. Well, Yara, Mosaic, some of these other companies might want to start doing that because it saves them the investment in a really huge, sunk cost kind of facility, high intensity energy use, to buy nutrients from farmers in a distributed way. It's there. It doesn't require energy at all to make this. It's organic, if you will. And it's already in the places where it's going to be used. It's in farming regions already, so you don't have to transport it. I mean, we have to rethink how our system works and who the potential partners are in this new journey that we're on.
Jason, I want to come back to that because I think it's very important to how we help farmers to go green without, I suppose, pushing them in further into the red. But I'd just be interested in one more, your views on the whole maybe global side of it and on the food production side. I noticed the recent Dutch agricultural minister, Caroline Schouten, was proposing a tax on unsustainably produced food. Do you think that could work, or has that a role to play going forward?
Well, I think that every government is kind of making decisions about what is sustainable or what is unsustainable, and they're designing programs to support the one and to kind of wean the other. So I'm not sure that this is new, but it's stark and it has a name on it, and so now people are talking about this. But I do think that we should be aiming for every product on the shelf to be more sustainable. Now, the devil is in the details. What is sustainable? And so from our point of view, we'd want to look at it from just on the environmental side, from a biodiversity and habitat point of view, from a water take and effluent point of view, soil health for sure, agrochemicals, and greenhouse gas emissions. There's not a whole lot of things there. And in each location, it's going to vary as to what's the most important. An area that's been farmed for 100 years is not going to probably have a whole lot of habitat that's up for grabs, but there are ways it can be farmed that may actually retire marginal land and produce more on what's left. I mean, those are the funny kinds of things that people are beginning to see. In fact, in the US, the Conservation Reserve Program was intended to take land out of production to reduce the excessive exports that the US had on agricultural markets. We took 8% of land out of production, and in 30 or 40 years, we had actually doubled the production on 92% of the land, but we reduced soil erosion by 50%. And those are things that we need to look at.
Yeah, and Jason, that actually takes me back to something many moons ago, back when you were in Ireland in 2013. You and I spoke about the sustainable intensification of agriculture. And what I get from what you're saying there is that we should look at our land assets and look at which land is most can yield the biggest dividend in terms of food production sustainably, and what land can yield the biggest dividend from an environmental biodiversity dividend. Is that where we should be looking at our land asset as a country in terms of how it can deliver across those parameters?
Yeah, I think that every farmer that I've talked to on 6 continents over 30 years has basically realized, when you push them, that there is land that they're farming where they're wasting their time and they're wasting the inputs they use, because it just doesn't pay off. Whereas if they use more time to focus on the better land, they'd actually produce more with less. To me, I think the concept of sustainable intensification has gotten a little bit hijacked, because people think, well, that means everybody farming every bit as much as they already are and doing it more intensively. And that may pose problems of nutrient runoff and all kinds of things. One of the ways farmers can farm more intensively is to use land as a buffer. And so creating habitat, creating biodiversity areas there actually increases their overall production, but reduces their impacts.
Jason, one of the things when we spoke before, and I think you're very strong on this, is, and it comes back to this, keeping farmers out of the red while they go green. It is the multiple income streams, and traditionally we look at a farmer's income stream as going out selling a bushel of grain in the US, or a ton of grain here in Ireland, or a kilo of beef, or whatever the case may be. But you argue that we need to be much broader in terms of thinking around income streams around farming.
Right. I think that maybe the best example of this, although we're seeing others now starting to pick up, is in Brazil with sugarcane. When I started doing research in Brazil in the 1970s, sugarcane plantations produced sugar. That was it. And they produced a whole lot of bagasse that became a pollution problem. And they were not terribly efficient, in terms of how they handled things. Over the next 10, 15 years, when the government started encouraging ethanol production, then they produced sugar and ethanol, and that began to change the way farmers farmed. And then 10 years later, they realized they could actually take all that bagasse and burn it and make energy from that. So now sugarcane producers in Brazil are really energy factories. They produce sugar, ethanol, and electricity. Well, I think we're seeing in the US already a move in that direction with dairy farming, where they're actually producing milk. They produce now 15% of the beef in the US, and they're doing it increasingly with genetics of beef crossbreeds with dairy cows. So they're getting graded US prime, but they're also then producing renewable energy with biogas digesters. There are 200 under construction right now. And they're producing now NP and K and liquid ammonia as nutrients that are coming off those biogas digesters. All of that is really diversifying their income stream. And depending on the price of beef or depending on the price of electricity, all those things can vary over time.
How, Jason, would you advise an Irish government, where we have an agricultural sector that is going to be see major change given our emission reduction targets that I talked about before, but to date has effectively no access to the renewable energy sector. We don't have any anaerobic digestion. Our wind energy tends to be large-scale corporate entities, very little micro generation, albeit coming. But how important is it that we intertwine the farming community in this renewable movement?
Well, I think you might want to just ignore solar energy from from the climate point of view. But in terms of
Jason,
wind,
maybe just tease that out for me, because that's a very interesting statement. Because certainly solar would be seen as something here that would be possibly a silver bullet.
well, I'm talking about Ireland's reputation for having a lot of rain.
Sorry.
And so if you've got a lot of rain, you're not going to produce a whole lot of solar.
I was reading too much into your statement, Jason. Go ahead.
Anyway, it is possible to put large wind turbines on farmland. And in fact, in pastures is kind of the easiest, because you can actually have grazing under them and stuff. So it's not a huge impact. There are business models that allow farmers to buy into that, though it's very expensive, but normally they rent. And in the US, where farmers have rented that land out or have a lease agreement, the payments they get are 10 to 100 times more than they make from growing crops where that land is. So it's not a huge impact from all of their land's point of view, but if you've got one of those turbines, it makes money. But in this case, I think Ireland's maybe got some other options here. The one thing about manure, cow manure, is that it is the perfect growth medium to produce energy. It's like the biogas digester. If you've got cow manure in it, then you can add any other kind of food waste, lawn trimmings, etc., into that, and it's like putting gasoline on a fire. It will produce much more. We have found that when you take dairy farm manure of one farm or multiple farms, bring it together, and then you add to that food industrial processing, or community food waste and vegetable based waste coming out of communities, 1 + 1 + 1 equals 4 or 5. It's not 3. And so you could take that and maybe become totally a new source of energy for the entire country if you could get that going. That would be interesting in terms of renewable energy, but then also the nutrients that you would need to be putting onto the pasture and the soil are not manure, which is a very hit or miss operation, because you don't know how many nutrients are actually in manure when you apply it to a field. You can, when it comes out of a biogas digester, you know exactly how much nitrogen or how much P or how much K or liquid ammonia, and then you can apply it as needed. I think that would be something I would really look at in Ireland, because you've got a lot of smaller farmers that actually can come together and create a kind of a community-based biogas digester, which can be quite a bit larger than any of those farms could support themselves.
Jason, the other element of in terms of the bioeconomy and that whole renewable side, and sort of income diversity, multiple income streams that you talk about, what we discussed before was carbon sequestration. Ultimately, agriculture, farmers are the only, land and forestry are the only sectors that can remove atmospheric carbon and lock it up in our soils. Is that really just a pipe dream for farmers, or do you actually see that whole carbon trading system and farmers getting recognition for the amount of carbon that they remove from the atmosphere actually turning into a revenue stream?
I think it's going, well, first of all, every farm has some land that they can't farm, whether it's ditches or mountains or rocky outcrops or whatever. And those lands, for the most part, are not being used to generate any income right now. So we think they can be used to generate, depending on where they are, some sequestration that could be carbon that you could actually measure and sell. We also think that in the near future, both biodiversity and habitat and nature generally are going to start having markets. And that's where that land could actually even be more valuable. But in the meantime, that carbon sequestration is going to be important. But we got to get the policies right. In the US, that program that I told you about, farmers were required to mow that land every year. So it wasn't allowed to sequester carbon. It's a pity, because after 30 years, you could have had some pretty interesting forests on some of those lands where it's wetter. But that was denied to the farmers to keep that, literally to keep that land in reserve to come back in production. And guess what? When the Chinese economy took off, a lot of that land did come back in production. And then we had the same problems with soil erosion all over again, because we had really resolved that problem to a great extent. I mean, 8% of land, taking that out of production and reducing your soil erosion by 50% is a really good deal from a federal point of view. So every country has to look at where they have the potential to sequester carbon and where they have and where it makes sense financially for the producers to do so. But I think it gets back to an issue of stop fighting the land that you shouldn't be farming. And maybe allow it to do what it does best, which is to grow crops that have different markets now, carbon markets or biodiversity markets or habitat markets.
In Ireland, Jason, where our average farm size is, certainly in a lot of our beef farms, is 20 cows or 70 dairy cows, that is probably more specific to regions of the country, that some parts of the country are better suited to the environmental dividend and whatnot, some parts of the country. Jason, I'm just going to go to our questions, and ladies and gentlemen, remember you can send us in your questions by text or WhatsApp on 086-836-6465. Jason, I've one here.
Can I just add one thing? If it's possible, technically, I'm happy to answer any questions that you don't have time for on the show.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll what they call it, Jason. We thank you for that, and I'm sure our listeners will as well. I've one here from Sive McKenna, Sustainable Scaries. Guys, thank you for inviting Jason Clay. What opportunities do you see for regenerative farming in Ireland? How can we establish it more? And what has made a difference in other countries?
Well, that's going to be a tough question, because what is regenerative farming in a country depends so much on that country, the geography, the rainfall, the crops you're producing, etc. But in general, there are more regenerative ways to produce both livestock and crops than the average farmer has been doing, because they're not trying to maximize those things. What they're trying to maximize now is production. Whereas I think that with the approach to regenerative, they're trying to reduce impacts, but also improve net income. So it's not about gross sales of, as you mentioned, tons or bushels or kilos. It's about how much at the end of the day that does the farmer have left in their pocket. That's what actually is going to matter. And so there are regenerative ag practices and livestock practices that are around soil management. I think they're also around not trying to produce things on land that's not terribly well suited for it. And so letting some of that land go, finding markets for that don't require you to degrade it. I mean, those are going to be important things. As we look at global commodities, one of the things that we're seeing is that about 25% of the land in any commodity produces about 50% of the impacts, but only about 10% of the product. So actually taking some of that land out makes sense, and certainly changing what you're producing on it or how you're producing it is going to be very important for the rest of that. But we've got to figure out ways to move that bottom.
Jason, I have a question here from a very entrepreneurial Irish farmer. What does Jason mean about a habitat market? Is that something I can get paid for?
Well, I don't know. Is Rabobank working in your area? They've started a program to look at how to finance habitat and biodiversity and kind of wildlife corridors. This is something that companies are beginning to talk about. This is probably 10 or 15 years off from more thorough assessments and looking at this, but it's going to be coming to a bank near you, I would assume. This is also something that governments could support instead of business as usual. This is something that could help maintain, the green in the countryside, but also make it interesting for a different kind of tourism, etc.
I've one here from a James in Kildare. Jason, I produce milk off grass. My carbon audits show me to be incredibly efficient. I adopt new technologies in relation to protected urea and low emission spreading slurry. I realize I have an environmental footprint, and I'm continuing to do more to try and reduce that. But if I'm prevented from maintaining my herd or even growing my herd into the future, my business will become unviable and production will move to a less efficient part of the world. How does Jason believe that we can prevent this from happening?
Well, I think diversification is going to be one of the ways. I think tapping into these new markets where they actually become significant parts of the income stream will be very important. If you're dependent on milk as your sole source of income, or even your 90% of your income, then what happens with milk production and quotas and often set prices tends to encourage efficiency in only one thing in one direction, and that's milk. But if there are other markets, then you can start looking at where the trade-offs are, where the labor trade-offs are, et cetera.
But I think one part of his concern, Jason, is if he doesn't produce it and world consumption that you talk about continues to push ahead, him getting out of production or reducing production, does that not have a negative impact on the global ambition to reduce the environmental footprint of feeding the world?
It is going to reduce the amount of food that's available through trade. And that's exactly, was my first question when I read the article about the Netherlands was, okay, so are you going to start taxing international food that's unsustainable, or are you simply going to reduce production in the Netherlands, which is going to have to be made up for someplace else? And those could often have much bigger impacts, say India, China, parts of East Africa, et cetera.
And Jason, I suppose to take that on from an Irish context, because I think you're really touching the knob here for farmers. Ireland does not have a heavy metal industry. It does not have a manufacturing industry. Agriculture is our largest indigenous industry, and it accounts therefore for I think over 34% of our total carbon emissions. We're also a major exporter of food. 90% of our food is exported. So on the same, our carbon emissions per capita are also exceptionally high. But what concerns farmers here is our farmers realize that they have a carbon or an environmental impact. They realize they have to do more. But I suppose where they feel that there's an imbalance is that if they are forced to actually reduce their output, or even in cases get out of production, for that production simply to be taken up in some other part of the world, that isn't delivering on what the global objective actually is.
Yeah, this is a tough question. I think that every farmer needs more options, and so they need different and additional markets. And what we now finally have is some of those that are starting to come into play. And so I wouldn't just throw in the towel yet or worry about that part of the future, because I think there are technologies that are in evolution that are going to allow farmers to take advantage of ways to reduce their impacts to more acceptable levels. But I would offer one word of advice here, and that is just to be careful, because in fact what we find is that as the science gets better, we realize that we're worse off than we thought. So it's going to get darker before you see light at the end of this particular tunnel. Don't despair about it. I think we can get through it. Everybody's going to be in the same boat. But as the science gets better, inevitably we find out that, yeah, we're not all using the same LCAs. So we didn't actually know what our impacts were. It's actually going to be worse because it didn't include X or Y or Z. The parameters weren't the same. The EU is coming up with a standard LCA methodology by 2024. That will help a lot, but it's still going to largely be based on a lot of averages. And you're going to be taking stock numbers out of databases. And so it'll take a while for that to work through the whole system.
Yeah, Jason, I have a number of other questions. We will follow up, but I'm just watching the clock has caught us as it inevitably does. Jason, Irish farmers, Irish policymakers listening to you here today, we have one of the lowest carbon footprints in terms of our beef and dairy production in the world. We have also to recognize that our agriculture does have an environmental footprint, both in terms of, and we've talked a lot about carbon, but also in terms of, as you say, water quality, biodiversity, habitat destruction and whatnot, and they're all issues that we have to deal with. What would your take-home message be if you were speaking at a conference here in Ireland today, as virtually you are, I suppose, to policymakers and to farmers in relation to how we should shape the future of our sector?
So there's been a lot of questions about either or. Either we can increase our production or we can take advantage of maybe some of these markets as they begin to develop, or we go out of business. I think that Ireland needs to start looking at an and approach. So you have established yourself as an exporter. I think,
yeah,
was it 90% of some of your
yeah.
products are exported, and it strikes me that one of the things I would do very soon is, in addition to sending dairy products to those markets, why don't you sell carbon sequestration? Why don't you sell habitat and biodiversity? Why don't you begin to sell through those same supply chains to those retailers and brands other things that they're starting to look for? I mean, this is where I think you could see values by piggybacking or doubling or tripling some of the values that you're putting into your trade. Don't just think about meat or beef or cheese or whatever, or butter. Think about the carbon sequestration. Think about avoided carbon emissions. We need to start linking those things, because we don't want to have a carbon market over here and a farm market over here. We want the two together, because that's what's going to make supply chains and producers more resilient. And you need to take advantage of that. So is there a way that the government can begin through, Board Bia or Origin Green, to start thinking about some of these kinds of positionings with Irish food exports?
Jason, listening to you, and as I say, we spoke before, but when we sat down to look at how, and we believe our role in the Farmers Journal is, we're fearlessly on the farmer's side, but that doesn't give us the luxury of telling people what they want to hear. We have to inform them of the wider debate and give alternative viewpoints. And when we sat down to discuss bringing you on board here, we thought, God, what will farmers think? I get very much from the sense, as Senior Vice President of the World Wildlife Fund, you don't see farmers as a threat to this. You see farmers as part of the solution and working with farmers for a better outcome, rather than maybe sometimes the farming community feels they're vilified and they're seen as the problem. I think what you're saying is, if we can position farmers and look at this multiple income streams around renewables, around carbon sequestration, around habitat regeneration, improvement in water quality, and in producing food for a market as well, that there is a future that we can coexist in terms of producing food and tackling the environmental challenges associated with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that farmers have impacts, and those impacts need to be reduced. But I have yet to meet a person that doesn't eat every day. We have to have food, and somebody's got to produce it. So we need to work with those that are producing food, not to just keep doing what they're doing today, but to get better. Because going forward, as I mentioned, the science is going to get better. We're going to be worse off. We're going to have, chronically drier years sometimes, or at least increased temperatures. All of that's going to affect, especially livestock production, because mammals are affected by temperatures. And so we need to get our arms around how do we embrace this change in order to address the impacts that it's going to bring to farming. We have to get ahead of these problems, and that's why learning about the technologies developed in one place or the practices developed someplace else. We need to work together to learn faster. But farming is very much at the heart of what humans are centered around. It's called agriculture for a reason. It's not called agri-industry. Well, there is that too, but that's something totally different. Yeah. So I think that we're all in this together, and we've got to figure out how our food can be produced in a way that we still have a planet.
And on that note, Jason Clay, sincere thank you very much from us all here in the Irish Farmers Journal for giving up your time. I think you've given us a lot of I think inspiration as well, but also challenge too, which is always good for an industry. Jason, with your permission, of course, we'd be delighted to send you on the questions and get the reply, and we'd be delighted also to keep in touch, Jason, and possibly maybe come back for an update in a few months' time when our climate objectives become clear, and we can discuss those. Ladies and gentlemen, you can keep up to date with everything that's happening in relation to this. It's an exceptionally busy week here in the Farmers Journal as we absorb the announcements or the direction of travel around the Climate Act, and our team are working on that, and we'll be providing detailed commentary and analysis on that in this week's paper on Thursday, and of course in farmersjournal.ie. We'll also be covering the interview here with Jason, which will be available to watch back on farmersjournal.ie as well, and over the coming weeks we'll be filtering Jason's answers to your questions back in both on our digital and on our print platform. Jason, thank you very much, and we really appreciate your time. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time as well.